"Who do you think you are, standing here?" The arrogant voice of flight attendant, Amber, rang out, echoing through the terminal, in front of dozens of stunned passengers. She snatched a first-class ticket from the hand of an elderly black woman and coldly tore it to pieces, scattering them on the floor. Vivian Miles simply bent down and picked up her fallen cane, her eyes calm, steady, and deeper than any storm. No one expected what would happen next. Moments later, a senior executive rushed over, bowed his head before her, and said, "Madam Chairwoman, I deeply apologize for this unacceptable insult." The entire airport fell into stunned silence. Amber went pale. Witnesses looked on as if struck by lightning. The woman who had just been humiliated and dismissed was in fact the founder and CEO of the very airline Amber worked for. A story so powerful, it forces anyone who's ever turned a blind eye to injustice to stop and reflect. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Los Angeles International Airport was alive with noise. Announcements echoed overhead. Wheels rolled across tile. People rushed past each other, barely looking up. But one figure moved differently. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't check her phone or look confused. She walked slowly, steadily, like someone who had nothing to prove. Vivian Miles, a black woman, likely in her 60s. Her posture was upright, her gaze calm. She wore a dark navy suit, elegant, not flashy, and in her hand she held a wooden cane, not the kind worn down by years, but the kind carefully carved, like a piece of art. She didn't say a word, but people noticed her. They looked up, and for a reason they couldn't explain, they stared. It wasn't fear, it wasn't fame, it was presence. Vivian didn't need to raise her voice or claim space. She carried a silent power. And without saying anything at all, she walked right toward the place where her dignity would soon be tested, and where the world would find out who she truly was. Vivian reached the first-class gate. The moment she stepped into line, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am. This is for first-class passengers only." It was Amber Grant, young, blonde, a flight attendant with perfect posture, and eyes that scanned like a security camera. She didn't ask to see a ticket, she didn't smile, she just blocked the path. Vivian looked her in the eye. "I know where I'm standing." "Thank you," she said, calm, firm. Not a hint of fear. But Amber didn't step aside. In her mind, Vivian didn't belong here. Not with her age, not with her skin color, not with that cane. Amber's jaw tightened. Her voice got colder. "I'll need you to prove you have a valid ticket," she snapped. Vivian didn't move, didn't argue. She reached slowly for her pocket, her fingers brushing the soft edge of her ticket holder. But that calm, it irritated Amber, made her feel challenged, like she was losing control. Around them, passengers had begun to notice. Some paused, some leaned in, pretending to fix their bags, but really watching. And still, Vivian stood there, silent, unshaken. A storm was coming, but she wasn't the one causing it. The tension thickened. You could feel it in the air, tight, heavy, like a string pulled too far. Amber took a step forward. Her tone sharpened. "I'm asking you one last time. Step aside or show your ticket right now." Vivian didn't flinch, didn't blink. She moved with grace, slowly reaching into her coat to retrieve her pass. But Amber didn't wait. She lunged forward, snatched the ticket from Vivian's hand, and in the same breath slapped away the cane that steadied her. The sound of wood hitting marble echoed like a gunshot. Gasps spread through the crowd. A few people instinctively reached for their phones. Others froze, wide-eyed, unsure of what they'd just seen. Vivian looked down at her cane, then up at Amber. Her face didn't twist with rage. She didn't raise her voice, but her eyes, those calm, steady eyes, turned cold. Amber, still standing tall, didn't back down. She crossed her arms and said loudly, "People like you don't belong in first class." The words dropped like stones. Everyone heard them, everyone felt them. But only one person had the courage to respond. Vivian bent down, picked up her cane, and whispered, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." And with that, silence fell. Time froze. Amber stood in place, her chest rising and falling fast, the ticket still crumpled in her fist, the cane on the floor, barely picked up, the crowd completely silent. And Vivian Miles, she just stood there, not angry, not shaken, but still unmoved, like a storm had hit her but left no mark. Amber took a breath, trying to reclaim control. Her voice rang out again. "I've already said enough. If you don't leave this area, I'll call security." But the words had lost their weight. People were no longer just curious. Now they were concerned, uneasy. Some began whispering. A few started filming. From a nearby corner, a young man in a navy suit slowly stepped forward. Julian Blake, an entrepreneur who had been quietly watching. He didn't know Vivian, but something about her presence and the way Amber treated her, it didn't sit right. Amber noticed him and stiffened. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not while on duty. But what she didn't realize, what no one knew yet, was that the woman she just humiliated wasn't just a first-class passenger. She was the name behind the airline itself. Amber tried to double down. She turned to the crowd and raised her voice. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, everyone, but we've had cases of people sneaking into first class with fake tickets. We take that very seriously." Her words stung. They weren't just an announcement. They were an accusation meant to shame. Vivian didn't react. She just stood quietly, holding her cane. But her silence said more than words ever could. Julian took another step forward. "Miss, maybe you should check the ticket before making statements like that," he said. Amber shot him a sharp look. "I'm doing my job, sir." But even as she spoke, her hands trembled slightly. The authority she clung to it was slipping. Then, a woman across the gate cleared her throat. Camille Thompson, a lawyer in her 40s. She wasn't filming, she wasn't whispering. She just stared hard and unblinking. "Do you treat all your passengers this way?" she asked. "Or just the black ones?" That question hit harder than any slap. Amber blinked. Her mouth opened, but no answer came. And that's when the room truly changed. This wasn't about a ticket anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been waiting too long to be called out. Amber's confidence cracked. She looked around, suddenly aware of the faces staring back. Not just passengers, witnesses. And she was no longer in control of the moment. Vivian finally moved, slowly. She stepped forward not to argue, not to defend, but to hand Amber something. Her ticket. Unfolded. Perfectly intact, the first-class seat clearly printed 1A. Amber took it with shaking hands, eyes darting across the details. Her face turned pale. The name, Vivian Miles. It meant nothing to her, not yet. So she tried to save face and, I need to confirm this with my supervisor. She stammered, but the damage was done. Camille crossed her arms. Julian shook his head. And Vivian, calm as ever, just said, "I hope your supervisor understands the cost of assumptions." Amber looked up. For the first time, she didn't see an old woman. She saw power, not loud, not flashy, just still and undeniable. In that moment, she realized she hadn't just questioned a ticket. She'd questioned a person, and she had no idea who that person really was. But she was about to find out. A hush swept across the boarding gate. The tension wasn't just thick, it was suffocating. Every person watching knew something bigger was happening here, something beyond a boarding pass, beyond one woman's pride. Amber still held the ticket in her hand, eyes flickering with panic. She glanced around, looking for support, looking for a way out, but there was none. So she made a choice, a terrible one. Without warning, she lifted the ticket and tore it straight down the middle. The sound paper ripping cut through the silence like a blade. Then another rip, and another. The ticket fell to the floor in pieces. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A few passengers actually stepped back, stunned. One woman covered her mouth. A man pulled out his phone, hitting a record without thinking twice. Amber spoke louder, her voice shaking with anger. "There. Now there's no more confusion. You're not flying first class today." Vivian didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked down at the torn pieces of her ticket, and then back at Amber. Her voice was soft, even, but cold as steel. "Are you absolutely sure you want to be responsible for what you've just done?" Amber didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Her throat felt dry. The eyes of over 30 people were locked on her, none of them supportive. Still, she held her ground. Or at least tried to. "I'm protecting the airline," she muttered, barely convincing herself. "If she wants to sue, fine. I'm not afraid." Vivian tilted her head, slowly. Not angry, not offended, but deeply, profoundly disappointed. She didn't need to say another word. The look in her eyes said it all. "You've crossed a line you don't even understand." From the back, footsteps echoed. Firm. Fast. A tall man in a dark suit appeared. Sharp eyes. Silvered tie. He moved like someone used to authority. It was Marcus Whitmore, Director of Flight Operations. He looked at the scraps of the torn ticket, then at Amber, then at Vivian. And without hesitation, he did something that made the entire gate fall silent once again. He bowed. Not a little nod, a full, respectful bow, to the woman Amber had just humiliated. "Mrs. Miles," he said gently, "please forgive us. We failed you today." The moment Marcus bowed, everything changed. Amber's mouth fell open, her face flushed. Her hands dropped to her sides, fingers twitching with panic. The crowd didn't speak, but their eyes said everything. Confusion, shock, recognition. Who was this woman? Vivian stood still. She didn't return the bow. She didn't have to. Marcus straightened, turned to face the crowd, and spoke with quiet force. "For those of you who don't know, Mrs. Vivian Miles is not just a first-class passenger. She is the founder and CEO of this airline." Gasps spread like wildfire. A teenager dropped his phone. A mother held her child tighter. Even the security guard at the far end of the gate took a step forward. Amber, she froze. Marcus turned back to her, his voice no longer soft. "And you, Miss Grant, you just publicly insulted the very woman who made your job possible. You questioned her identity, you destroyed her ticket, and you did all of it because of how she looks." Amber couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could barely stand. And Vivian, she didn't gloat, didn't smile. She just looked away, as if she'd seen it all before. Because she had. Amber stood frozen. Her ears rang. Her world collapsed in slow motion. People were no longer whispering. They were filming. Some were shaking their heads. Others simply stared at her, as if they no longer recognized the uniform she wore. Vivian hadn't said another word. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any reprimand. Marcus turned toward security. "Escort Miss Grant to the captain's cabin. Immediately. This will be dealt with before the plane leaves the ground." 2 uniformed officers approached. Amber flinched, but didn't resist. As they led her away, her steps were shaky, like someone walking a hallway she knew she'd never return from. In the crowd, Julian Blake lowered his phone. Stunned, Camille Thompson placed a gentle hand on her chest. Breath caught in disbelief, and all around them, passengers began to understand. This wasn't just a scandal. This wasn't just a racist mistake. This was a moment, one that no one watching would forget. And as the doors closed behind Amber, Vivian finally looked up. Her eyes swept over the crowd, not angry, but tired. Tired of this story playing out over and over, in different uniforms, on different days. Inside the cockpit, Amber stood alone. Captain Hernandez looked up from his logbook. He'd flown for over 20 years. He'd seen turbulence mechanical, weather, human. But this was something else. Beside him sat Lydia Cole, the airline's vice president of operations. Her face was unreadable, her silence cold and professional. "Miss Grant," the captain said, "do you know why you're here?" Amber nodded weakly, but said nothing. Her voice gone, her authority shattered. Lydia leaned forward, voice even and cutting. "You insulted a black woman in public. You destroyed her property. You humiliated our founder. You violated every core value this airline stands for." Amber finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who she was." Lydia's eyes narrowed. "And if she hadn't been the CEO, would you still be standing here, or would you be celebrating, thinking you did your job?" The words landed like bricks. Amber looked down. There was no defense, not anymore. Just shame, raw and unfiltered. And outside that cockpit, passengers were still talking, still whispering, still recording. Because something important had just been revealed. And there was no erasing it. Amber stood in silence. She had no script for this moment. No uniform rulebook to hide behind. Just herself. And the truth she couldn't deny anymore. "I was wrong," she finally said. "I judged her because of how she looked." Lydia didn't nod. She didn't offer comfort. She let the words settle heavy and necessary. "You'll be removed from this flight," she said. "An emergency disciplinary hearing will follow. But make no mistake, your actions today have consequences. For this airline, for our reputation, and most of all, for you." Amber blinked back tears. Not because of the punishment, but because she realized too late how far she'd fallen, and how small her world had become, shaped by prejudice she'd never questioned, until now. The captain pressed a button on the comm panel. "Security," he said. "Prepare to escort the flight attendant off the aircraft." And just like that, Amber's career didn't end with a ceremony. No farewell, no recognition, just silence. As the door opened behind her, she looked back once, hoping for a second chance. But none came. And somewhere behind her, Vivian Miles was still seated in first class. Calm, composed, and carrying the silent power that Amber had tried to ignore until it was far too late. Back in the first-class cabin, Vivian Miles sat perfectly still. She hadn't moved since the incident, hadn't looked around, hadn't spoken, but her presence filled the room. Not with noise, not with demands. Just gravity, like something bigger than the moment had just arrived. Passengers whispered quietly now, but not in mockery, in awe. They weren't just looking at a woman anymore. They were looking at history. A life lived through trials most of them would never understand. A strength built not from titles, but from decades of surviving what others only read about. The seat beside her remained empty, and the seat across from her filled with silence. Julian Blake, still watching from a few rows back, opened his notebook. He didn't know why. He just needed to write something down. True power doesn't need to shout, he scribbled. It just sits quietly and waits to be seen. Vivian glanced out the window. Clouds passed slowly across the blue sky, and somewhere inside her, something stirred. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to deny her place, but today it would be the last time she stayed silent about it. The cabin remained quiet, but beneath that calm, the energy had changed. Vivian turned slightly, not to speak, but to stand. She rose from her seat. Slowly, with grace. Passengers instinctively shifted in their chairs, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. No one said a word. She walked forward, cane in hand, not stumbling, not timid, each step quiet but firm, measured, like she was carrying something heavy but invisible. At the front of the cabin, a steward stepped aside. Vivian stopped, turned around, faced the passengers, and then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it reached every corner of the room. For some of you, I am just a woman who boarded a plane. She paused. But for others, I was a test, one that you didn't know you were taking. The silence deepened. I was tested, too, she said, tested for patience, for dignity, for restraint. I passed mine, but someone else failed theirs. Eyes dropped, hearts pounded, because her words weren't cruel. They were truth, and the truth, when spoken softly, hurts the most. Vivian looked slowly across the cabin. I've spent my life walking into rooms and being told, with silence or stares, that I didn't belong. She let that sit, no rush, no drama, just truth. But I stayed in those rooms. I built in those rooms. I led in those rooms. And some of those rooms became mine. Julian sat forward, hands clasped. Camille closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over her. Vivian continued, I didn't come here today to teach a lesson, but the moment chose itself. She turned her gaze to the front, where an empty crew seat sat the one Amber had filled just minutes ago. That young woman didn't just doubt my place in this cabin. She doubted my worth. And in doing so, she revealed her own. Vivian didn't speak with bitterness. She spoke with legacy. Every syllable shaped by decades of being overlooked, then rising anyway. Finally, she stepped back toward her seat, one hand on her cane, one on her heart. Not a single person clapped, but every heart in that cabin was standing. Down the narrow corridor of the aircraft, Amber sat alone. In a jump seat near the rear galley, her uniform still neat, but her face crumpled. Tears had dried, but the sting remained, not just from embarrassment, but from realization. She had always believed she was professional, polite, firm, yes, but fair. But today that belief shattered. She wasn't in trouble because of a mistake on paper. She was in trouble because of what lived quietly in her mind, the quiet, racist judgment she didn't even know she'd made. Lydia Cole entered the galley, holding a sealed envelope. Amber stood barely. "You'll receive your formal notice at the next gate," Lydia said calmly. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Your access credentials will be revoked." Amber nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. But as Lydia turned to go, Amber whispered, "I didn't see her. Not really. I just assumed." Lydia paused. "That's the problem. Amber," she said, "you didn't see her. And people like her have spent a lifetime being unseen." She walked away, leaving Amber in silence. And this time it wasn't powerful, it was punishment. At the front of the aircraft, Vivian had returned to her seat. She didn't relax, she didn't recline. She simply sat with the quiet of someone used to waiting. Waiting for change. Waiting for people to grow. Across the aisle, Julian leaned forward. "Mrs. Miles," he said softly, "if you ever write a book, I'll be the first to read it." Vivian smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I should write it soon. We're running out of time." He nodded, not fully understanding, but knowing her words came from a place deeper than books could reach. Just then, a murmur moved through the cabin. Richard Vaughn, president of Global Operations, had boarded, tall, stern. But when he reached Vivian, he bowed his head with quiet reverence. "Miss Miles," he said, "you have our full apology and our full attention." Vivian looked up, her voice still calm. "Good. Then maybe now you'll start paying attention before the cameras are rolling." Richard said nothing, because there was nothing more powerful than that reminder. Vivian wasn't asking for justice. She was demanding it. And in that moment, everyone felt it. In a private meeting room beyond the terminal, Amber sat facing a panel. No passengers, no cameras, just silence and judgment. Across from her sat 3 executives, people she once hoped to impress. Now, she could barely meet their eyes. The head of the panel opened a file. "Miss Grant," he said, "you've admitted to publicly shaming a black passenger, tearing up her valid boarding pass and making false accusations, all without evidence." Amber nodded slowly. "I didn't think. I just acted." "No," the executive replied. "You did think. You just thought she didn't belong." The words hit harder than any formal charge. Amber sat up straighter, tears threatening to rise again. But this time, she didn't cry. She spoke. "I don't ask for forgiveness," she said, voice trembling. "But I want to understand. I want to change, because the truth is, I didn't just hurt her, I hurt what we stand for." The room fell still. And for a moment, the panel didn't see a uniform. They saw a young woman cracked open by her own mistake. The chair of the board closed the file. "There will be consequences. But whether this becomes your ending, or your beginning, that's up to you." The flight was quiet now. Not tense, just thoughtful. Passengers sat still, eyes gazing out windows or down at their hands. No one scrolled through their phones. No one asked for champagne. Everyone was still thinking about her Vivian Miles, the woman who had spoken with grace, not revenge, who had stood up without ever raising her voice. Back in her seat, Vivian sipped her tea, black, no sugar, just lemon, simple, strong. Amber, now seated across the aisle under watch, leaned forward slightly. Her voice was barely audible. "Miss Miles, I don't know how you stayed so calm." Vivian turned her head. Her gaze was soft, but there was a weight behind it. Because rage burns fast, she said, but dignity lasts. Amber swallowed hard. She nodded slowly, realizing she hadn't just witnessed a reaction, she'd witnessed a masterclass in restraint. Vivian added quietly, "If I had yelled, I'd be the angry black woman. If I had cried, I'd be weak. But silence forces people to look at themselves." Amber looked away. Not out of disrespect, but because for the first time, she finally saw herself. Vivian leaned back slightly. Her fingers traced the rim of her teacup, slow and steady. "I've been where you are," she said. "Not in the same uniform, but with the same shame. The kind that doesn't come from being caught, but from finally seeing the truth." Amber's lips parted. "Surprised? You've made mistakes." Vivian smiled faintly. "Of course. I've judged people too, spoken too soon, been blind to someone else's struggle, because I was too focused on my own." Her voice dropped lower. "But here's the difference. When I was corrected, I listened." Amber breathed in deeply. That kind of honesty, it didn't sound like a lecture. It sounded like an invitation. Vivian turned toward the window. The sky outside had begun to darken. Clouds brushed against the glass like soft warnings. "Pain teaches," she said, "but only if you stay in it long enough to learn." Amber didn't speak, didn't nod. She just sat there, letting those words settle inside her. And in that quiet, something started to change. Not in the air, not in the cabin, but in her. Minutes passed. Then, softly, Amber spoke. "I thought I was better than this," she said. "I've read the trainings. I've smiled at everyone. I never thought I was racist." Vivian didn't correct her. She didn't rescue her either. She just waited. Amber swallowed hard. "But now I see it. It's not about being loud. It's not about hating someone openly. It's about that moment when you look at someone and decide they don't belong." She looked directly at Vivian. "And I did that to you." Vivian nodded, slow and measured, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. "You did," she said gently, "and now you've named it." Amber's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. She held them back, not to be strong, but to stay present. Vivian leaned in, her voice like a whisper in a storm. "The moment you stop defending your ignorance is the moment you start breaking free from it." Amber closed her eyes. That was the lesson. Not what happened in front of everyone, but what happened after, when the noise faded and the truth stood still. The plane began its descent. Seatbelts clicked, trays folded. The quiet hum of landing filled the cabin. But something had shifted. Not just in altitude, but in atmosphere. Vivian glanced out the window one last time. The clouds had parted. City lights below sparkled like reflections of something far bigger than a skyline. Across the aisle, Amber sat upright. She was still suspended, still accountable. But she was also something else now. Awake. She watched Vivian, not with fear, but with respect. As the wheels touched down, a gentle applause broke out, not loud, not forced, just real. Passengers weren't clapping for the landing. They were clapping for what they'd witnessed. For truth. For dignity. For a moment they'd carry with them long after the plane had stopped moving. Julian caught Vivian's eye and gave her a quiet nod. Camille mouthed a simple word, "Thank you." And Vivian, still seated, still silent, simply smiled. Because sometimes, the loudest voice is the one that never had to shout. The plane rolled to a smooth stop. Lights overhead glowed softly. People began gathering their belongings, but no one rushed, no one pushed forward. Vivian stood slowly, cane in hand. She moved with the same grace she had arrived with, but now, every eye followed her. Not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. As she reached the exit, the captain stood at attention. He opened the door for her himself. "Thank you for flying with us, ma'am," he said. Vivian paused, looked him in the eye. "No," she replied softly. "Thank you for learning." She stepped onto the jet bridge not as a passenger, but as a presence. Amber remained seated in the back, watching her disappear down the corridor. She didn't call out, didn't ask for a final word. She simply sat there, holding the weight of her lesson. And something else. A decision. Because change doesn't happen with applause, or shame, or orders from above. It begins in quiet moments, like this one, where silence isn't the absence of sound, but the beginning of something new. Outside the terminal, the city stretched wide beneath a golden sky. Vivian stepped into a waiting car. No cameras, no news crews, just her and the driver, who nodded respectfully without asking questions. As the car pulled away, she leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and breathed. Not with relief, but with clarity. What happened today wasn't new, it had happened before. To her, to others, to names the world forgot and faces that never made headlines. But this time people saw it, and more importantly, they remembered it. Back inside the terminal, Amber stood before a restroom mirror. She didn't adjust her hair. She didn't reapply her lipstick. She just looked at herself, and for the first time, saw the reflection without defense. Behind her, a mother with 2 children entered, gave a polite nod, and walked by. Amber nodded back, but this time with intention, with awareness, because from now on, she would see more than what was in front of her. She would see what had always been hidden in plain sight. And maybe, just maybe, she would help someone else be seen, too. That is the quiet revolution of silent power. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.